Hello, and welcome to the Atlantic Council. My name is William Wexler, and I lead the Atlantic Council's work on the Middle East as the director of the Rafiq Hariri Center and our Middle East programs. You know, every country in the world is responsible for its own defense, and that means understanding its adversaries. Uh, Quite often, more often than we'd think, countries end up going to war without being fully prepared because they don't fully understand their adversaries. But there are some conflicts in the world where the two adversaries in that conflict have spent years, decades understanding each other, understanding their order of battle, understanding their decision parameters, understanding their politics, understanding their tactical operations and strategic level decisions. One of those such dynamics in the world is between Israel and Hezbollah. And yet, despite all of that thinking, despite all of that preparation, in 2006, Israel and Hezbollah fought a war that neither of them intended to fight. It goes to show, it's a lesson in case we needed to learn it yet again, about how dangerous the world is and how sometimes events go in directions that for which we're not fully prepared. Now, of course, we are a decade and a half beyond that war, almost, and and it's time to think about what a future war might look like between Israel and Hezbollah. The report assesses the likelihood and possibility of another conflict. To have the two authors of that report with us, Nick Blanford and Asaf Orion. They both have deep expertise from both sides of this conflict. Nick is a non-resident fellow with us with the Atlantic Council's Middle East programs. He is based in Beirut, and he covers the politics and security affairs of Lebanon and Syria. He is a well-regarded and well-respected expert on Hezbollah, and most especially the organization's evolving military activities, which have remained a focus of his work for the past 2 decades. Asaf is a senior research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv. He previously served with the Israel Defense Forces for 32 years and currently directs INSS's research programs on Israel's relations with China, with delegitimization campaigns around the world, and is also a very well-regarded expert on Syria, on Lebanon, on the Israel-Palestinian conflict, amongst many other issues. We are also very happy to have Dr. Mara Karlin joining the two authors on the panel. Mara, with whom I had the pleasure of working at the Pentagon, is a director of strategic studies at Johns Hopkins SAIS, where she serves as a defense for strategy and force development. Before that, she had a variety of policy positions in the Department of Defense, including as Levant director. And finally, let me welcome our distinguished moderator, Diane Nissenbaum, who is a Beirut-based reporter covering U.S. policy in the Middle East and regional security for the Wall Street Journal. Many people listening in now will be very familiar with Diane's reporting throughout the region, which is really unmatched. You know, throughout the discussion, please feel free to send questions as they come to your mind via the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please identify yourself and your background when you write a question. After the panelists make their introductory remarks and Diane has a chance to ask a few questions, he'll pick questions that you ask for the panelists. Diane, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Will. Thanks to everybody for joining us. the pandemic's giving us this unique opportunity to bring these authors together from both sides of the border here, and also bring in the U.S. perspective. I've had a chance to read the paper. I definitely recommend to everybody to read it. It's got some amazing insights from these two experts on both sides of the border. There are areas of agreement and there are areas of disagreement with the authors here, and we're going to talk about that when we get to the question and answers later. I think we're going to start with Asaf, and we'll go to Nick, and then we'll go to Mara for some opening comments. We'll have a moderated discussion, and we should have plenty of time for questions and answers, so we'll look forward to that. And with that, I'll turn it over to Asaf to kick us off.
Good morning. As in any serious issue, there are good news and bad news. The bad news is that since the 2006 war, Israel and Lebanon both enjoy an unprecedented quiet along their common border. Both Israel and Hezbollah are uninterested in war, and there's a mutual deterrence between them. This mutual deterrence is a stabilizer. It's mainly based on the mutual assessment of the severe damage and limited benefits of such a war to each of their respective actors. And also, this deterrence is based on the fact that both assess that this war is a real possibility. It may erupt. Now, the current context is that in Hezbollah public criticism. And recently we've been updated that Germany decided to designate both wings, the military and political wing of Hezbollah, as a terror organization, joining many others who already did that. Now, what the bad news are is that since the end of the 2006 war, both sides are seriously preparing themselves to the possibility it will erupt. As I said before, it helps deterrence, but it also grows some escalatory potential. Their potential or capability to inflict mutual damage has seriously grown since 2006. And this is why and we are now looking at between 1,000 and 2,000 rockets and missiles per day. On the receiving side in Lebanon, we should be expecting impacts of thousands of targets per day in Lebanon. And this translates to over 100 times more than the Hezbollah capability. We're talking about massive precision strike here. This is why Hezbollah is trying to improve its impact numbers through the precision-guided munition project. And another part of the bad news is that the security regime designed in Security Council Resolution 1701 was seriously eroded. We understand that today Hezbollah is politically dominant. Its rivals have been weakened. Its influence over the Lebanese armed forces has increased. Its illicit military capability out of the state's control has grown, we think roughly 10 times, but that's only quantitative. There are quality issues there. It accumulated experience of operational fighting in Syria, at the same time suffered thousands of casualties. And we think that its deployment along the blue line, along the Israeli border, has seriously increased. We've seen the exposure of the tunnel project, cross-border assault tunnels. 6 of them were exposed by the IDF at the end of 2018. We see ongoing observation, like operational observation, reconnaissance, and patrolling. We see presence of Radwan units, that's special forces units ready for raid and attack and assault. And occasionally, when it chose to, it also implemented anti-tank attacks, IED attacks, and recently cut the fence just to show that it can't. And another indicator for that is its harassment and impediment of movement and access of the UN forces there. So UNIFIL is more or less neutralized. Hezbollah and Iran are busy opening another frontier with Israel in Syria, Golan Heights and beyond. And bottom line is that as the Syrian war is dying out, Hezbollah now is able to refocus many of its efforts back to Israel. I think that's a good enough exposition to kick out the day. Thank you.
Thanks, Asaf. Let's kick it up to Beirut to talk to Nick Blanford and get your assessment from this side of the border about how close we are to war and what a war might look like from this perspective.
Okay, thanks very much, and good afternoon from Beirut. This is the capital of a country that's obviously facing many crises at the moment, among them economic collapse, the protest movement since last October, rising unemployment, soaring prices, capital controls on bank accounts, and all this has been worsened by the coronavirus shutdown. So it's all pretty gloomy here right now, so much so that it's really pushed the perennial concerns of another war between Hezbollah and Israel out of most people's minds here. But despite the coronavirus pandemic, the campaign between the wars has continued. So just this morning when I was preparing my comments, I could hear the rumble of Israeli jets flying over Beirut on their routine reconnaissance patrols, or possibly on the way to bomb another target in Syria, which has been happening since January 2013, as the Israelis have been trying to thwart the buildup of Iranian forces and their allies in Syria, mainly through airstrikes against their positions and deployment. The rules of the game currently dictate that Israel can attack targets in Syria without incurring a tit-for-tat response. But if Israel attacks inside Lebanon, Hezbollah will respond. And we've seen that twice now, once back in in response to the deaths of a couple of Hezbollah fighters in Syria and a rather bizarre drone strike in southern Beirut. So, you know, as Asaf has said, neither side is seeking a war for now, because both sides know that the next conflict is going to make the 2006 war look like a walk in the park. But as Asaf said, you know, they've been preparing for the next one since the last war ended August 14, 2006. As we discussed in our paper, unless there is a trigger factor that prompts one side or the other to unilaterally launch an attack, the most likely scenario that leads to a war currently is a tactical incident that spirals out of control through miscommunication. The war, examine how the IDF and Hezbollah would prosecute a war, and hardest of all, of course, is recommendations to at least maintain the current relative calm and offset a conflict that could cost thousands of lives and bring unprecedented ruin to both countries. I think Asaf and I broadly agreed on the analysis which forms the bulk of the paper. We had a slight divergence when it came to offering recommendations, which is why we've split the recommendations into a joint section and recommendations from the Lebanese and Israeli perspective. I think the strength of the paper, counting the cost, is that its two authors have very different backgrounds and different perspectives based on our experiences. And I hope that has given the paper an added value. I wrote my first article on Hezbollah and the conflict in South Lebanon back in the summer of '94, a few months before I moved to Beirut. And watching the evolution of Hezbollah's military capabilities in real time has been a fascinating experience. So back then, Hezbollah numbered between 3,000 to 5,000 fighters, both part-timers and full-time folks. They just acquired their first wire-guided anti-tank missile, which dated back to the 1960s. The largest rocket they had was the 122mm Grad, which was capable of sailing across the Israeli occupation zone and peppering targets in northern Israel. They had a small parliamentary presence, but it wouldn't join the government for another 11 years in 2005. As the 90s progressed, the organization gradually earned the respect of a cross-section of Lebanese because of their martial prowess against the Israelis in the south. So, of course, all that culminated in the Israeli decision to withdraw from South Lebanon in May 2000. We're and it's probably no wonder that Israel over the last couple of years has classified Hezbollah as its number one conventional threat. Of course, Hezbollah has moved well beyond the confines of the front with Israel in recent years. So apart from fighting Syria, they deployed into Iraq and as part of the anti-ISIS campaign. They've also sent specialists and trainers and advisors and so on to Yemen. And essentially, Hezbollah has become Iran's greatest force enabler, allowing Tehran to project influence across the Middle East. But paradoxically, as Asaf also touched upon, despite Hezbollah's military strength, it does face a host of challenges, both internally and externally, and we can certainly discuss that in our conversation. So I think I'll stop there and hand back to Diane.
Great, thanks, Nick. Let's go back to the U.S. and talk to Mara and get your assessment of the paper and the U.S. approach here, and how you see the situation from there.
Great, thank you so much. It's really a treat to be here with such terrific folks. And if you haven't read the paper, I thought it was just superb and terribly thoughtful, which is entirely unsurprising given the authors, and I really recommend it. You know, from a U.S. perspective, when you think about an potential Israel-Hezbollah conflict, there are really two comments that come to your mind. The first is when, not if. You know this is going to occur. You just don't know when exactly that will be. And the second, kind of like the old joke of the falling man, is so far, so good. I think Nick and Asaf put it perfectly in their paper where they said, a fine line separates a tense calm from a destructive war. And exactly as Nick was just saying, we just don't know what will be that sort of tactical event that kicks it off, but it's going to happen. And therefore, it's worth considering the parameters and the permutations of what this might look like. It was interesting to hear Nick say he was writing his first paper on Hezbollah in the mid-90s. I was also doing so in the late 90s while living in Jerusalem, while waiting for the Israeli military to pull out of Lebanon. The air was really thick there because everyone knew the prime minister had announced that the Israelis would be pulling back. It was really just a question of when that would happen. Fast forward a few years to the war that has been studied ad infinitum, the 2006 summer Israel-Hezbollah war. So at the time, I was serving as the Levant director, which is the senior staffer to the Secretary of Defense, trying to figure out what we do about U.S. policy towards places like Lebanon, the Palestinians, Syria, Jordan, etc. And the war broke out. And from a U.S. perspective, I would say we faced a trilemma. In order, the three elements of this trilemma were: first, how do you get 15,000 Americans out? Second, how do you support the Israelis, a very close U.S. partner, particularly against Hezbollah, in which the U.S. obviously has a really, really long and sordid history? And third, what do you do about this nascent relationship with the Lebanese? Post the 2005 Rafik Hariri assassination, the U.S. had been slowly taking steps to deepen its relationship with the Lebanese writ large, and in particular with the Lebanese military. In fact, the first tranche of assistance was supposed to arrive right as the war kicked off. It ended up doing so just a little bit later. So this war happened. We all are deeply cognizant, of course, of how it played out. It has been studied ad infinitum, as I noted. And in particular, from a U.S. perspective, yes, the U.S. got all of the Americans out in what had been the largest non-combatant evacuation operation in U.S. history, although probably a little slower than one would have liked. Yes, the U.S. supported the Israelis as they were trying to wreak havoc on Hezbollah, but I think it would be safe to say the U.S. was a little surprised at how little havoc the Israelis actually managed to wreak on Hezbollah specifically and on Hezbollah leadership. And yes, the relationship with the Lebanese, particularly the Lebanese military, was able to develop and flourish, and it's now become pretty decently strong 14 years later. So now we're sitting here, of course, 14 years later, and we're looking at a landscape that is really different. We're seeing a landscape in which this administration in particular has effectively given the Israelis free rein to do whatever they want regionally. We're seeing Hezbollah that has just gotten a whole lot stronger and has gotten a level of operational experience, particularly courtesy of the war in Syria, that I think is just kind of far and away what it had ever done before. We've seen a Lebanese armed forces that has also developed into a decently capable force. Indeed, I might say about as capable as it's probably going to get. Obviously, we've seen Syria that has melted. And from a US perspective, we've seen the push for a maximum pressure campaign against Iran, which hasn't really borne a whole lot of fruits, either in terms of dealing, I would say, with weakening or changing Iranian policy across the region. So all this is a way of saying, while the landscape has changed profoundly across the region, I don't actually think it changes the fundamentals, which is that some sort of tactical event will occur. We can hypothesize about what those might be. And when that does occur, there will be a conflagration that is ugly, that will result in a lot of deaths. And I think this time that will also occur on the Israeli side, not just on the Lebanese side, and will force the US to ask itself some really hard questions about how and in what ways it wants to severely weaken its adversaries and support its partners. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Mara. I was based in Jerusalem in 2006 when the war kicked off, and I remember getting the text message about the Hezbollah border attack that kicked it off, and saying to myself and the people around me, like, this can't be right. Why would this happen now? So I think for those of us, especially in the region, let's start with this question that really is unanswerable, because during this meeting, there could be a triggering event, or, later this afternoon, there could be a triggering event. So I know it's a little bit hard to really assess how close we are to a triggering event, but we do have some benchmarks. And the reporting was that they fired this warning shot, kind of this knock shot, initially, so that the guys could get away and they could hit the car as a warning, which the messaging that came out of that was Israel doesn't want to trigger a war. And Hezbollah responded with the cutting up the fence and a few other things that are not that provocative. So I know, again, it's hard to answer, but let's start with you, Asaf. How close do you think we are to a triggering event that triggers this? Low, medium, high?
Well, that's betting work. And in this business, all bets are off. You can ask Qasem Soleimani how safe it is to assume that the US will continue doing nothing. And then there is the ring. So let's look at the possible instigators or the fuses leading to the Lebanese powder keg. One can be a US or Israel attack on Iran, perhaps because of the nuclear program, which is currently advancing. And the common assumption is that this is what Hezbollah was actually built to do, to deter and to exact cost should Israel attack the nuclear project. Second is the precision, or the PGM project, which Israel said we're not going to accept. Either you stop it or we Nasrallah said, we can't have that happening in our capital. This is a red line, and let us show you how it's enforced. It also coincided with a couple of Lebanese guys serving with the Quds Force, busy launching a UAV attack. So that was another tit for tat. When the tunnels were taken, some IDF readiness was under the assumption that Hezbollah may counterattack. When Hezbollah is working to establish itself in the Golan or attack Israel from the Golan, this is not a separate frontier. It's seemingly separate, but many times it floods over or moves over. In 2015, there was an attack on a Hezbollah patrol, killing 7 Hezbollah and 1 Iranian general in the Golan Heights. And in January 2015, it was like the 18 was in the Golan and the 28th was in Lebanon. We got an anti-tank attack by Hezbollah from Lebanon into Israel. And there were 2 dead IDF soldiers. But incidentally, it could have been 10 because the second missile missed the second vehicle by 2 meters. And the same happened just in September. So tactical occurrences are a very thin line between let's call it a day because nobody died, or let's have a serious retaliation because we lost too many people. And my focus on this is understanding that the contact line, the blue line presence of Hezbollah, the activity, the ongoing usually the main approach of people dealing with Lebanon saying, well, let's call it a day.
Side of the border where there's reports that they had dummies in there, suggested a real choreographed kind of game here. What's your sentiment of how Nasrallah looks at the risks of war and the benefits?
I think that the Asaf was right. On July the 11th of 2006, no one would have guessed in Lebanon that we were going to go to war within 24 hours. Hezbollah wasn't even looking for a war in 2006. It was a mistake, a miscalculation, if you like, of the Israeli reaction. And the consequence of that was a month-long war. And although Hezbollah was able to declare a divine victory at the end of it, they've been very careful since then not to try to provoke some kind of renewed conflict with the Israelis, to the extent that they have not resumed the Sheba Farms campaign. If you remember, between 2000 and 2006, Hezbollah would periodically stage mortar and rocket attacks against Israeli positions in the Sheba Farms. And Hezbollah called these reminder operations to remind the Israelis that Hezbollah was still around, and as far as Hezbollah was concerned, that the Israelis were still occupying Lebanese territory. But since 2006, even those operations have stopped. And just to go back to that January 2015 incident that Assad spoke of, and this really was illustrative of the fine line that we mentioned in the report. Now, I was in the Bekaa at the time driving north, and I got a phone call that there had been an attack in the Sheba Farms. So we turned around and started heading south. Then somebody called me up from Beirut and rather breathlessly said, "Have you heard the news? They've killed over 20 Israeli soldiers. The entire column has been wiped out." At that point, we stopped driving south and started heading west to get back to Beirut before the bridges were blown up, because 20 dead soldiers meant we were going to war. So it's a very fine line that we've been watching ever since 2006 to see. I think so many people in this part of the world expect another showdown. It's just a question of when and what is going to trigger it. as far as Hezbollah is concerned, they don't want another war, but of course they have been preparing for one. They've been very active and busy in Syria. The conflict in Syria is winding down. They're beginning to look towards the future in Syria in terms of deployment, to extend, if you like, what they have, a military deployment in Lebanon, to swing it around to Israel's northeast into the area of southwest Syria. But I think, Israel has faced this problem going all the way back to 2000, when Hezbollah, after the Israelis had pulled out, Hezbollah began this process of increasing its military capabilities, acquiring new weapon systems and so on. And I remember when Ariel Sharon, who was prime minister at the time, I think this was 2002, was on his way to Washington. And before he went, he gave a press conference and announced that we know that Hezbollah has got 6,000 rockets pointing at Israel, and this is intolerable. Now that number by 2006 had increased up to 14,000. And then after 2006, it jumped to 50, 70, 130, 150,000, all Israeli estimates. Now we're seeing or hearing about Hezbollah improving the accuracy of these various rockets, turning them either into missiles or improving the accuracy of existing missiles. And Asaf alluded to this just now. Is there a threshold point when the Israelis say enough is enough?
Development of the precision-guided munitions, the PGMs, as we call them here. And your report embraces Hezbollah in this ability, and if there are hidden PGM factories somewhere here in Lebanon that we don't know about, or what's the state of their ability to transform their stockpile into these more dangerous weapons?
Well, this is, we will talk to our sources. There's no hard data in terms of how far Hezbollah has progressed. One of my contacts tells me that they've been upgrading some of their existing rockets, turning them into guided missiles for 2 years. And that includes the M600, which is a guided missile. And they've been trying to increase this is the one that carries the 1,100-pound warhead. Back in 2010, 2009, when it was first reported that they had acquired these missiles, the CEP, the circular error probability, in other words, the area in which the missile is likely to fall, had a diameter of, or radius rather, of 500 meters. So it could fall within 500 meters of its target. And apparently that has now been increased up to within 10 yards. I don't know if that's true or not. This is what a lot of people have been reporting. I think the Israelis maybe have a different view on this. There was a satellite image I think the Israelis produced maybe almost a year ago, allegedly showing one of these locations in the Bekaa Valley, in an area which is under Hezbollah control. Whether they are building missiles there, I don't know. Whether the Israelis messaged that deliberately to warn Hezbollah that, we know where you're doing this, so watch out. I don't know. I think Asaf could probably talk on that more accurately than me.
Asaf, do you have an assessment from there? I think you're on mute. Do you have kind of an assessment from that point about the PGM capabilities and how advanced they are?
From what I saw that was released and disclosed, we're talking about probably several dozens in the current arsenal. This is what I found published. About the capacity, there's always a question of how many you can produce and how many you do produce. And then where do you deploy them? And this is a tricky game because as in many issues of war, there's a paradox there. Hezbollah would like to have stronger impact on Israel, but without getting into war. Israel looks at that potential as as a threat, as a growing threat, if this jumps the step of becoming a serious to a point where it starts considering a preemptive attack before it's used. Now, preemption is part of our strategic culture, but we most of the time use it against nuclear threats. If this precision project is becoming very massive, it might even tempt Hezbollah into a first strike. Stabilizer, not destabilizers, not just stabilizers. It's not something that is contained under the bin of when the war starts, it will impact. It impacts already the pre-war to a point when it actually can advance or bring to war.
Yeah, one of the, I think, fascinating things about your paper is both of your guys' exploration of what the war would look like. And I hope to get into that a bit more. Maybe we'll get into the question and answer period, but the time, of course, is going quickly. So I want to move to how we might prevent the war. And the paper talks a lot about the Lebanese military here, the LAF, as it's known, which Mara, you were there at the beginning for this effort to build them up. And I was based in Washington until last fall and had plenty of discussions with Trump administration officials about our relationship with the LAF. And there's a split within the administration over whether or not they are a reliable partner or whether or not they are infiltrated by Hezbollah, which is a term that I've heard some hardliners in Washington use to describe the LAF. There's always U.S. officials come here to Beirut and say LAF has to do more to contain Hezbollah. What is your assessment from Washington at this point about the LAF and what the U.S. can do to put pressure on them, and how far the LAF can go in terms of containing this threat, and what the U.S. should be asking of the LAF in this regard?
Terrific. Just before answering that question, I do want to add that as we were pondering the different kind of dynamics that might lead to war, obviously there are domestic Israeli issues, there are domestic Lebanese issues, there's the understanding or lack thereof of one another's escalation ladders. But I do want to ensure we're not seeing this as just a bilateral discussion, right? Because obviously there are all sorts of things that the Iranians could do that could result in a conflict happening as well. And so we do want to have that wider aperture. Your has to have a certain level of expectations of what is possible, and one should not live in butterflies and unicorns world, which I think is frankly the danger, kind of the dangerous view that a lot of folks have. There are a lot of folks who will say things like, this is the military of the state. It is, like militaries are supposed to, it is supposed to ensure that there's a monopoly on violence exerted by the state. The paper, I think, does a magnificent job of some mutually agreed threats. Hezbollah is not a mutually agreed threat. And frankly, any efforts to push the Lebanese military to deal with it will not turn out the way that I think some of those hardline folks you're citing might want them to. So instead, your expectations should be rather low, but also significant insofar that the Lebanese military can deal with mutually agreed threats like anti-ISIS elements, like Al-Qaeda elements or Al-Qaeda affiliates. There's actually a lot of goodness there. It may not ultimately have the sort of transformative effect that folks may dream about in Lebanon. But frankly, I think that's terribly impractical. And so it is important to ensure that the Lebanese military is taking steps against those sorts of actors. And I do think US officials should strongly encourage them to do so. It's important that they do so responsibly, right? It's important that they take all sorts of important steps, say, to deal with civilian casualties, to preserve human rights, et cetera, et cetera. But fundamentally, the very best case scenario out of this relationship is that the Lebanese military will deal with mutually agreed threats that are generally Sunni radicals.
One of the interesting, I think the recommendations about the laugh in the report was one of the places where you saw this difference of opinion between the authors here. I think, Nick, the report lays out exactly what you say here, is that you have to have realistic expectations about what you can ask of the laugh. But Asaf, I think you may have a different opinion. I think may I give you a chance to explore it. Would that be right? Can you sort of tell us what you think the world should be asking of the LAF in terms of addressing Hezbollah and the PGM program, and whether you think the US and others should be pushing them harder?
Of the Litani in impeding UNIFIL's access to places of Hezbollah violations, including missile launches areas, including tunneling areas, including observation areas. My colleague from the Washington Institute, Matt Levitt, is just publishing a piece on Green Without Borders. That's seemingly an environmental organization, but it's a Hezbollah facade, and it's enjoying Lebanese armed forces guardianship. And we know that for an effective force, you need both capability and political will. I am sure that the LAF is fully, or let's say, deeply infiltrated. Like anything in Lebanon, I don't think it's an homogeneous organization. There are people with different opinions and different interests, and they hail from different parts. And I don't think we're really using the leverage of this aid and support to any serious ask. And in this sense, I'm not saying, okay, unless you fight them, stop the aid. By the way, I have colleagues in Israel saying the LAF is lost. It's fully infiltrated. There's no daylight between Hezbollah and LAF. It's one and the same. The national command chain from the president and down are all complicit with Hezbollah, and you can read it in the UN reports. It's very evident. And so saying just give
century, as you said, you've seen it go, you've seen Hezbollah grow and grow. Is that your assessment, that the LAF here, the Lebanese military, is infiltrated by Hezbollah and that it is essentially corrupt to the core?
No, I don't agree with that. The relationship between Hezbollah and the LAF is incredibly nuanced. You have two armies in a tiny space, and they compete with each other. Yes, there are overlaps of cooperation. There has to be, realistically, but they act on a kind of a case-by-case deconfliction program. there's a lot of unhappiness within the LAF, the relationship. If you're a proud Lebanese soldier, and this is the one Lebanese institution that does gain cross-sectarian, nationwide support. The Lebanese well remember that some of the worst parts of the Lebanese civil war occurred when the LAF collapsed in 1976 and again in 1984. It was very interesting to watch first of all, the LAF's campaign in the Nahr al-Bared Palestinian camp back in 2007, to which Mara alluded when they were dropping old static aerial bombs out of Huey helicopters, World War I style. And then you advance 10 years after the US had kicked in with its military assistance program, and you saw what they were capable of against Daesh, against ISIS up in northeast Lebanon. It was a very slick, professional campaign, very well planned. It drew the admiration of foreign military observers. And the most interesting thing I thought about that whole campaign was Hezbollah's response. I won't go into all the details now, but I did write about this in a bit more detail in a piece for the Atlantic Council that came out about 2 or 3 weeks ago. But Hezbollah had a kind of a spoiler campaign in 2017 that the Lebanese army is capable of mounting quite sophisticated operations. And it was also very telling that on the day of the ceasefire, after the Daesh guys were sent out of the country, the army allowed the press to come up to the battlefield and have a tour of the theater. And I remember talking to one of the soldiers there, and we were talking about the Hezbollah campaign, which had preceded the LAF operation. And he was grumbling, and he was saying, look, we know that Hezbollah wanted us to fail, but we didn't. And there was a lot of pride within the LAF amongst soldiers on the ground that they'd been able to prove to the Lebanese and to the international sponsors and backers that they were capable of doing the job. It is incredibly complex, and Asaf has a justified argument, and I know that the critics of the assistance program can come across as convincing, and they have a kind of a justified argument. But I think we also need to look beyond the LAF Hezbollah rationale for maintaining this program, because Lebanon is on the brink of total collapse. And this is going to get worse going ahead. We're talking now about a rise of criminality. The spending power of the individual Lebanese soldier has declined because the lira has plummeted against the dollar in the last 3 months. If it continues like this, you have a potential of the LAF beginning to disintegrate, like in 76, like in 84. And if the LAF disintegrates, then you're going to lose complete stability in Lebanon. The Lebanese police are incapable of maintaining a kind of a nationwide security plan. You could see the rise of local communal militias, defensive militias, protecting their sort of patch of turf, which could then be exposed to manipulation from external or internal sources, become politicized, accept money for weapons, and so on and so forth. This could lead down the road, if you have increasing lawlessness, to the troop-contributing countries of UNIFIL beginning to think, we can't stay here any longer, it's time to bring our boys back. So it's fundamentally important. I mean, Hezbollah is a luxury right now. The priority right now is to safeguard the stability of Lebanon. And I think this is why the US assistance program really needs to continue, and maybe even look at it in more creative ways, in the sense that the LAF right now doesn't need new tanks or artillery pieces. They need to be able to maintain unit cohesion so that the soldiers are comfortable knowing that their families are being looked after and they're being fed, and that they can continue to do their duty and serve in the army, rather than thinking, I've got to get out of here and go and find another means of employment to look after my families. And that's where the LAF would begin to disintegrate and everything would fall apart. So it's not just about Hezbollah, I think. I think we have to look at these other issues as well, especially now.
Mara, you've probably had a lot of these conversations yourselves with Lebanese officials going back to the first war. What's your sense about the realistic expectations? And you've got a Trump administration now who's attempting to pull back from the region. My sense is their influence, particularly here, is waning. Their priority has always been on backing Israel and saying Israel has its right to defend itself, and sort of essentially, as was mentioned earlier, giving Israel sort of carte blanche to do what it wants in the region. What role do you think the Trump administration now can play in this to prevent another war and to try and advance some of these goals? What tools are there for this administration, and how much influence can they really have?
Well, I think that's a really important question, not least because I don't really see them doing it. And I don't really see a kind of deep desire. As you noted, there has been an effort to pull away from the Middle East. This is actually sort of baked into the latest national defense strategy, where there's increased focus in particular on challenges posed by China and on Russia, and decreased emphasis on the region, which is one actually that I think makes sense. But look, Lebanon is this place that, if we look at sort of U.S. policy over the last few decades, there are these moments where you have administrations that care a lot about it. You saw this in the Reagan administration. You saw this in the second Bush the Bush 41 administration. But then there are others that just don't find it terribly interesting, find it to be pretty complicated, to put it lightly. And your options in dealing with these issues are usually awful versus catastrophic, which is one of the points I might just highlight, to Asaf. I'm deeply sympathetic to his arguments. I absolutely am. And yet these are ultimately political issues at the end of the day. And ultimately, the Lebanese military isn't going to make those political calls, which then turns, I think, to your great question, Diane, about what the U.S. can do. I mean, the U.S. can engage its partners inside Lebanon, and its closest partners really are in the Lebanese military, which, as Nick underscored, is the most respected institution in the country. Although I think these days it's we're talking about the possibility of an Israel-Hezbollah war. It would seem to me one of the worst things for Lebanon would be if the Lebanese military chose to get involved in that conflict. That would absolutely, completely destroy any U.S. assistance for the Lebanese military. So best case scenario from the Trump administration is that we would see a whole lot of diplomacy and diplomatic engagements with Lebanon. We haven't seen a whole lot, a little bit by Assistant Secretary Dave Schenker, but that's about it. And instead, we've just seen a whole lot of threats. And I think keeping to the extent you can keep the assistance to the military, as long as it involves a lot of really hard, important discussions about how, when, and in what ways will the LAF use this aid, and how won't it? That's all going to be critical. But look, ultimately, as much as we may find these topics tremendously interesting, I don't think there's a lot of evidence that the Trump administration is prioritizing it or will do so.
Great, thanks. Let's shift to some questions here. I'm just starting to get them. You can ask them in the Q&A. Try and get to as many as we can. The first one we've got here is from Ken Pollock. It's for you, Nick, here in Beirut. It's talking about sort of what would be the triggering event here. He's saying that for decades, Hezbollah has threatened that in the event of an attack on Iran by Israel or by the US, Hezbollah would respond by attacking Israel. And in your report, you do say that that would be the most likely triggering event for a Hezbollah response. And as you guys note in the report, that would invite a devastating response by Israel, the so-called Dahia doctrine. For those in the region who know, this is the threat by Israel to basically decimate large parts of Lebanon where Hezbollah has fighters, likely creating extensive civilian casualties and raising concerns about violations of international law. So that was something that happened during the 2006 war. There was tremendous pressure on Hezbollah because of the attacks in Beirut and the civilian casualties that mounted just over that month. So he's asking if you, Nick, could kind of give us a sense of what Hezbollah's thinking is about this. If they were asked to
Yeah, sure, he would do it. That's the discipline, that's the deal, regardless of the impact on Lebanon. But I think it's more important to look at the perspective of the Iranians on this rather than the Hezbollah leadership. The Iranians know essentially, the build-up that we've seen really from 2000, but particularly from 2006, the military build-up of Hezbollah, in large part serves as a deterrence for Iran against the threat of an attack that could prove either be limited to the Iranians would calculate very carefully any attack on Iran. I mean, if an American soldier was to fire a bullet across the border, they're not going to tell Nasrallah to go and invade northern Galilee and fire rockets into Tel Aviv. Even if there was an attack on the nuclear facilities, it doesn't necessarily mean that the Iranians would instruct Hezbollah to retaliate in full scale, because essentially Hezbollah for the Iranians in that scenario is a one-shot option. You can launch a war against Israel, you can have a devastating war, you're going to cause a lot of destruction, a loss of life in Israel, same of course in Lebanon, but there's no guarantee that Hezbollah would emerge from such a war, A, victorious, and B, able to rebuild its capacity to the pre-war standard or even better, in order to serve as a continued deterrence against a second attack against Iran, which may be larger in scale and may be designed to topple the regime. So I think the critical thinking will come from Iran on this. Do they want to exploit Hezbollah as a retaliation for some kind of attack that's occurred in Iran, or do they absorb that attack on Iran? They have countless asymmetrical options, excluding Hezbollah, which they might be able to exploit around the region, maybe internationally, and save Hezbollah for the rainy day. But when it comes to the crunch, if the Iranians feel that the attack that they're under is potentially existential, then all bets are off. The phone will ring and Dahi, Nasrallah will answer and say, yes, sir, and they will get on with it. That's the discipline.
Asaf, do you think we're going to see if there is a war, the enactment of this doctrine that's been laid out? I've had my own discussions with some Israeli officials who, as I think you mentioned in the report, say that's partially psychological threat as a deterrent, but you also do say in the report that they would enact it. Are we looking at an incredibly devastating strike, and then it just becomes a question of whether or not Nasrallah and Hezbollah back down?
I think that's a classic question of lack of imagination. Nick chose a Sun Tzu title for this piece that we wrote, and built its military machine inside the communities. It started as a guerrilla organization. So two guys in a pickup with several rockets hiding in the garage is a great idea because there are prohibitions and Israel won't strike civilians for two rockets. But then when you expand it into 130 or 150,000 rockets, and you do it throughout like 300 villages or military villages, and houses throughout South Lebanon have a bathroom, kitchen, living room, and a rocket room. It makes most of the military assets a combination of a military target, which hitting it is beneficial because you decrease the damage to your own, and immediate collateral, at least on property, if the populace evacuated indeed. So first think about multiplying what I said in the beginning, thousands of impacts per day. Now think, let's say, I don't know how many thousand, it's mentioned in the IDF strategy, but let's say that thousands begins in 2000. So within a week, you have something between 15, 20, maybe more broken and devastated houses. This is Syria on fast forward. I don't think this mass has been seen in modern warfare. of such a massive precision strike. Now, Beirut, famous for the Dahia, is, yes, it's a center of Shiite community, and it's full of military targets embedded inside population. So do you believe that while this Hezbollah arsenal provided by Iran is falling out of the sky onto Israel's cities and towns, Israel will say, well, I need to watch it, and maybe this building will be hurt when I take out the coastal missiles or the rockets or the surface-to-surface missile launches or the command posts or whatever? I don't think so. So whoever chose to put its military assets inside its own habitat actually wrote out massive destruction to its own habitat the minute it goes out of control. So I think Dahia is a reduction to what we're up against here. This is a serious, earthquake and hailstorm and tsunami together.
Nick, do you want to talk about that anymore? I don't know. We'll give you a chance to sort of talk about how you think the Lebanese population might respond to that kind of attack on Lebanon.
Well, I mean, the southern Lebanese have been through this going all the way back to 1972, with invasions in 78 and 82, 1993, Operation Accountability, Grapes of Wrath in April 2006, and the 2006 war, of course. So even these days, when tensions in the south are few and far between, when they do rise, you will find southern Lebanese packing their suitcases, making sure they've got their passports and cash, put it by the front door, ready for a speedy evacuation. And I suspect that if another war kicks off, and it's likely to be a very sudden kickoff, like in the past, there will be a huge exodus of people leaving southern Lebanon and leaving Dahia as well, to get out of the firing line. Obviously, there's going to be a huge number of casualties. The Dahia doctrine was espoused the first time, I think, in 2008. So it's become a very familiar phrase in Lebanon. But I think the Lebanese would expect that kind of damage anyway. I mean, I remember driving around the villages in the 2006 war, particularly after the ceasefire kicked in, and the devastation was, amazing. 80% of villages have been turned into rubble, and we're going to see that. I think we have a picture in the report of Aitishab, which is about a kilometer from the Israeli border, which the IDF was unable to capture throughout the war, despite continued fighting. This is where the kidnapping operation occurred that actually triggered the war. And the village was almost completely destroyed. And I think our caption in the report, makes the point that this is what happened to Aitishab and other villages in 2006. This level of destruction is going to be on a much wider scale in the next war.
We have a question here from Barbara Slavin. I think maybe Mara, you can, this might be one best for you. It's asking, what would the impact be of a relaxation of tensions between the US and Iran? If there were
tensions between the US and Iran are relaxing, I do see that to be the case between Iran and some of the Gulf states, however. But look, at a minimum, it won't be unhelpful. Because as much as I think throughout the last hour or so, we've outlined a whole bunch of ways in which the Israelis or Hezbollah could take steps to result in some sort of conflict. I did mention earlier that Iran obviously plays a pretty important role in the background, and Nick I think, expanded on this pretty well also. So a lowering of tensions is probably a good thing, but I'd be really curious to know where we're seeing a lot of examples of that. Instead, it seems to me the maximum pressure campaign has only continued. The kind of push on sanctions has only continued, particularly in spite of COVID. And I don't know that the Trump administration is kind of willing to kind of rethink its approach to Iran, to the JCPOA, et cetera.
Okay, there's another question here from Dominic Hofstetter at Fletcher School of Law. asking about JCPOA following the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA. How will Israel's proactive counter-proliferation strategy vis-a-vis Iran change when factoring the threat of a powder keg from Lebanon and Hezbollah? Asaf, maybe that so you could take that one, because in your recommendations you talk about one of the needs here is to basically, I believe, continue the campaign, the kinetic campaign against any efforts by Iran to get missiles to Hezbollah. I think you're on mute. Yeah.
It's interesting to see how you read it, but what I said is that we need to understand that Iran's arming and equipping is part of the gathering storm of this war. Now, I didn't say we need to attack it more, but this is an option. But we need to actually understand and recall the resolution, the United Nations resolution on arms and embargo, on exports from Iran, on imports to Lebanon, to non-governmental Lebanon. All those resolutions are out there and they're not being implemented. So I think the thing here is that 2006 brought special circumstance of urgency and people wanted to prevent the next war. But the longer years of quiet with which I started to describe today, I think they, let's say, persuaded people to believe that the war is not so imminent and quiet today is better than taking risk of prevention. So you hear on this war a lot of talk about preparation, and this is what militaries do, including Hezbollah. A lot of talk about explaining why it won't happen. I would say repression or thinking, well, denial, but less focused efforts on trying to prevent it, on trying to prevent the arms and the build-up, to understand that wars erupt and start even without the parties wanting this to happen, and this is why we chose the as Mara said, it's not if, but when, unless we do something about it. We need to understand that much of what we thought in 2005, 6 after Hariri was assassinated and the war ended, well, the world is different today than what we designed at the time. That 1701 is eroded and Lebanon became part of the problem and not only part of the solution. So there are many efforts on the arming, on pressurizing Hezbollah, on demanding the Lebanese government accountability for what it's responsible to. One of our attendants asked, and what about the Israeli flights and the Lebanese sovereignty? It's a tough call to say, why aren't you respecting my sovereignty when you allow your territory to be used by mental militias and third parties, aggression against new grounds, because the old talking points will not prevent war. They will just better explain how we got there. And just as an anecdote, we ask who in Israel has the war authorities to declare war. Actually, most of our serious conflicts in the recent years were approved as a small military operation, limited, and it was recognized as a war only in retrospect by the decoration and ribbon committees afterwards. So when you go to that initial tit for tat, you don't think of it as the first steps of war. Nasrallah said, if this kidnapping of 2006, I knew it would lead to war, I wouldn't approve it. And also, the Israeli government at the time approved something very limited in its opinion. So people are not in prevention mode in this sense. And when you read throughout the publications on this issue, there's a lot of wishful thinking, a lot of continuity, and a lot of denial that the current policy doesn't actually get us nearer to where we want it to be, but actually farther and closer to war than we intended. I think that's
So maybe Mara, we could start with you on that. You know, should the UN mandate be strengthened here? What's your sense about whether the UN has enough authority to do what it needs to do in the South? You know, what more should we expect from the UN in this part of the world?
Sure, it doesn't have the authority one would want. We can expect more, but those expectations won't be met. I mean, I don't mean to be so terribly like bleak and stark, but I think it's important that we're all sober and clear-eyed about what UNIFIL can and can't do. You know, as one of the people working on 1701 as the 06 war was ending, there was this idea that UNIFIL would get fattened up. You'd add a couple thousand folks, at least, and by fattening it up, even though you couldn't get a stronger mandate forward, UNIFIL will kind of help fill the space. Southern Lebanon's only so big. Obviously, what ended up happening is then the Lebanese military deployed to the south for the first time, which was a really, really big deal. And so could you, again, just fill the space, knowing, though, that at the end of the day, UNIFIL is not going to do a lot of the things that I think folks might want it to, because it's composed of member states, right? And those, you know, states don't want to get into a conflict. And so to the, you know, with very low expectations, it seems to me UNIFIL is most helpful, not just in filling the space, but in reporting on what it sees. You know, Asaf quoted some UNIFIL reports, which are really interesting. That's, in my mind, kind of the best case scenario you're going to get out of UNIFIL. So we can sort of have all these desires of what it might be, but ultimately, that's just not what a force, you know, a peacekeeping force does. You know, for folks who remember what the acronym stands for, remember it includes interim in it, and this thing's been around for decades.
UNIFIL at a time when the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah has not been resolved. I mean, realistically, I don't think you need 10,500 peacekeepers on the ground, especially as they are limited to a certain extent in their activities and the places that they can go to and so on. The liaison channel played by UNIFIL between the Lebanese and Israelis, the Lebanese army and the Israeli army, is incredibly valuable and is easily the most important component of UNIFIL's mission. But yeah, I agree with Mara. I mean, I think you have to be realistic about the circumstances there. When UNIFIL tries to exert itself a little bit, there is pushback. You will see an increase in local people in the villages acting in a hostile manner towards passing UNIFIL patrols, throwing stones, stopping vehicles, taking weapons, GPS devices, cameras if they have them, this kind of thing. This is like the local powers showing UNIFIL who's boss on the ground. And UNIFIL is very conscious of force protection, and understandably, really going back to the 1980s, even when Hezbollah was first emerging in South Lebanon, rather puzzled by all these foreigners wearing uniforms and marching around with blue berets. And the French battalion at the time was hit several times, and they ended up withdrawing their forces. More recently, in the summer of 2007, when you had the Spanish battalion, the Spanish joined UNIFIL after 2006, along with the Italians and the French, so as a powerful European component to the force. The Spanish were being a little bit more diligent than perhaps was prudent. And in July, or at the end of June that year, a Spanish patrol was hit by a very sophisticated roadside bomb consisting of 60 kilograms of PETN, augmented by aluminium powder in a shaped charge configuration, detonated by a photocell beam that killed 6 Spanish peacekeepers. Now, officially, the UNIFIL Spanish and Lebanese investigations into that attack remain open. There was no claim of responsibility, but the UNIFIL battalions, all the UNIFIL soldiers there, understood that there's only so far that you can really go, and it was a lesson that they've taken to heart since then.
Asaf, what's your sense of the UN mission here, and how much the world should be pushing them to do more? You're on mute still.
We need to be balanced and realistic about UNIFIL. The liaison part is essential. I worked with this mechanism, but it comprises of several dozens people at a good day. So it's the force commander, it's the liaison, it's some liaison teams. It can be expanded a bit. You won't get into more than 50 or 60 people justified for that mission. Then there is the question of how do you interpose and deconflict on the blue line. And for interposition, you need probably to be accessible and so on, let's say 3,000 people. But UNIFIL is 10,500 people strong, and most of them are inaccessible to wherever it's relevant. At the Washington Institute, where I'm an international fellow, I wrote last year an exhaustive report of the whole UN reporting system of how Hezbollah's campaign of stopping UNIFIL, impeding it, anti-access, anti-area, documentation denial, deterrence, the whole shtick. So these locals that Nick is describing are not local villagers. They're Hezbollah teams because they have the same tactical behaviors and procedures. So we should think about several issues here. One is what happens if war starts and 10,000 idle peacekeepers find themselves in harm's way in one of the world's blazing and densest battlefields. Like, think about putting them in North Korea in the sense of artillery. Now, do you want the French, the Spanish, the Italians, European nations, other nations, South Koreans, and others under fire needlessly in an unjustified mission? I think that's not a free meal. I sat with a widow of a peacekeepers from 2006, which was a collateral damage, very unfortunate. Do we want to multiply that by 10,000 people? No. So if you can't justify the mission of 10,000 people, and as you read in the reports, they're inaccessible to important places, there's a strong signal to send to the Lebanese government. If you can't protect, if you don't interrogate and investigate all those who assail and assault UNIFIL, and there is a famous incident from August 4th, 2018 in Majd al-Zoun, in which they were battered and their vehicle set on fire. And the UN is still awaiting the government of Lebanon to finish the investigation. And every Security Council report ends or includes a bit from 1982 awaiting results on the death of 2 Irish peacekeepers. So I suggest that we treat our Blue Berets colleagues in respect, that we don't deal with their lives lightly. This is not an easy mission, but we need to cut the force to size, and we need to decide if the mandate is inachievable. You don't need a size. So if the mandate is only partial, you need less size. One thing that we can insist on getting is honest reporting, geographical reporting, visual documentation of all those who assault them, immediate access to the places where the Lebanese government impedes access, even when missiles were launched from the position. So I think that, again, it's not an all or nothing, like UNIFIL as is or leave at once. No, I think we need to squeeze and to match authorities with size and budget and condition it to the host nation's support. If the host nation doesn't support, you can't afford staying so large.
Thank you. We're almost out of time. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of the questions. One last question that came up, Asaf, that we haven't talked about is the issue of cyber war. And what is your assessment about the fight being in cyberspace? That's certainly a new battleground. What do you think we'll see there?
It's not a future question. We were just saw reports on Iranian hacking of medical companies around the corona research. We saw a report of an attack on Israel water infrastructure in the last week. Hezbollah has a long effort on this. This is a frontier that you don't see flashing, but it's always active.
Okay, thank you. To give you guys maybe just 1 minute each to kind of touch on anything that I may have missed. Maybe we'll go backwards and start with you, Mara, for your kind of closing comments.
Sure. Thank you for such a terrific and thoughtful discussion. I suspect folks are not leaving this conversation feeling like we're just brimming with butterflies and unicorns, and that's probably appropriate. I guess what I would say is kind of like my opening comments. It can always be a lot worse, right? So we can focus on how the Lebanese military isn't doing XYZ things vis-a-vis Hezbollah. And that is valid and problematic, to be sure. And yet it would also be worse if they weren't at least taking actions on other threats. So, your options are pretty terrible. And to the extent that we can stay 3 to 5 steps from a conflict, that's probably a good thing. At the end of the day, ultimately, and I think Asaf made this point really, really well, this is not a sustainable dynamic, right? We are all just sort of kicking cans down the road. And at some point, it's going to explode and it's going to be pretty bad. Thank you.
Thanks for leaving us with that optimistic view. Nick, are you as optimistic as Mara about things exploding eventually? What's any comments you want to make before we sign off?
Well, I've always felt there was going to be another conflict the moment the last one ended, and it was just a question of time. In much the same way that even in the period between 2000 and 2006, I was sure that there was going to be an explosion at some point, and it was really just a question of when and what the trigger is going to be. And we're in that same dynamic now as the pre-2006, except both sides obviously much more powerful, they're much stronger, but they're also much more cautious. And the lessons of 2006 are still being absorbed, the risks of miscalculation and so on. But I mean, we didn't really get into this point, but Hezbollah is going through its own agonies at the moment. It's one of these sort of paradoxes that it's never been more powerful politically, but it is facing domestic issues, the sanctions regime against Iran, against individuals in Hezbollah and affiliated with Hezbollah. This is an organization that was born to fight Israeli occupation and Israel itself. But we've seen only a handful of operations instigated by Hezbollah, 6 or 7, I think, since 2006. That's it. So you have a whole new generation of Lebanese who have grown up since 2006, who aren't really aware of the threat of Israel beyond the rhetoric they might see on TV or in speeches, and of course the contrails of passing Israeli jets over the Bekaa or Beirut. But of the Israeli withdrawal from South Lebanon. That's 20 years. So you do have this new generation that have grown up, who I think it's become harder and harder for Hezbollah to sustain what they call the resistance priority, keeping a communal focus on the Israeli threat and having new generations of fighters or recruits join the organization, and to maintain this strong anti-Israel stance. I don't think time is really on Hezbollah's side on this. But we'll have to see. I mean, you know, we're having this debate now about the next war between Israel and Hezbollah, but from Lebanese perspective right now, the main threat is the Lebanese economy. And although we started this paper long before the protests broke out in October, long before this economic fiscal collapse that Lebanese is experiencing now, I think the Lebanese are really focused on this war, and the notion of trying to push back against Hezbollah, even Hezbollah's political opponents in Lebanon. I mean, this is kind of a luxury for the future. First thing is to try to stop the country from disintegrating and to get some kind of economic plan underway to bring things back to perhaps where they were before. That seems to be the priority these days. It's a very gloomy picture in Lebanon, I'm afraid.
As someone who's exchanging some precious US dollars today on the black market, I certainly know what the situation is like here for all of us. And we'll leave Asaf with you to give us the last word here. And I definitely encourage everybody to read the paper for a deeper exploration of all of these ideas.
Yeah, I think it's worthy finishing seeing what Nick said as an opportunity. So there's a huge economic crisis. Lebanon is more needy. That's time to revisit how we think about supporting Lebanon, stopping just wishful thinking based support, and asking the Lebanese government to be accountable for what it does. And there are a lot of mechanisms providing support to Lebanon and to the Lebanese armed forces, which can be performance-based. And I'm not saying a pie in the sky demand, but realistic issues. The gas prospects in the Mediterranean, although the recent reports were that some of the drilling came out empty, but it is potential. And for this prospects to be developed, both Lebanon and Israel should vouch for security. Nobody would start pumping gas in a fireworks area. So there's a common interest of development. It can herald the maritime border delineation if we find the right space to discuss it. We have a very interesting, I think, precedent between Israel and Hamas. Hamas, a pure terror organization in the eyes of Israel. It's a bitter enemy. It's inconsolable. We won't have peace in the foreseeable future. But there is a quiet and mutually denied discussion of security arrangements, security for economy arrangements between Hamas and Israel through Egypt without recognizing each other. I don't think that's beyond reach with Hezbollah. These are, I would say, people with bounded rationality, and on issues of this earth, they're pragmatic. We can discuss security arrangements on the perimeter, on distancing parts of Hezbollah from the blue line, on disputed areas along the blue lines. You can think of border negotiation issues. You can discuss flights. You can discuss precision. You can discuss Rajab. This is where Nick and I, let's say, disputed when Nick said Israel should, and I said, well, Israel could. So between S and C, but bottom line is when you boil it down, run through the war into the aftermath in your imagination and think, what are the issues at hand? There's no serious border issues, no serious water issues, no serious funds or things like that. The Palestinian refugee issue is now down to scale with the real refugee issue of Syria with 1 million people, not 170,000. And actually, there is one issue standing between us, and that's Hezbollah's insistence to serve Iran in threatening Israel. Without this threat, Israel has no problem with Lebanon. And I think that's a promising premise to think about, strategic goals in wars. If you have no serious goals, why go there?
Well, I'm glad we're able to end on a bit of an optimistic note there, surprisingly. Thank you all for joining. Appreciate your time, and we'll see you again on the next Zoom.
Inshallah.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.